All right, let's jump right in, folks. Welcome back to another deep dive, and this time we're tackling something that might just become your new best friend in the AWS world, something called Trusted Advisor.
Ah, trusted advisor. It's like a hidden gem that so many people overlook, but it can really make a difference.
Especially when it comes to saving money and keeping things running smoothly.
Absolutely. So, for anyone who's hearing about this for the first time, what exactly is trusted advisor?
Yeah, let's break it down. Imagine having a virtual consultant who's always got your back, constantly analyzing your AWS environment.
Exactly. It's like having a second set of eyes, constantly looking for ways to optimize
And
things.
this optimization, it goes beyond just cost, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It covers a whole range of areas: security, performance, fault tolerance, even helping you avoid hitting those pesky service limits.
So it's really about making sure we're getting the most out of our AWS setup and doing it in the safest, most efficient way possible.
Precisely. It's all about following best practices. And, AWS has a lot of best practices.
And this is where Trust Advisor really shines, right? It takes all those best practices and applies them to our specific AWS environment.
Exactly. It's not just giving generic advice, it's looking at your unique setup and saying, hey, based on what you're doing here, you could be doing this better.
So it's tailored, personalized advice,
Mm.
and it's coming from a source that really knows its stuff.
You got it. And the way it does this is through a system of checks.
Checks. What kind of checks are we talking about here?
Well, think of each check as a specific test that Trusted Advisor runs against your AWS configuration. It might check your security group settings, your S3 bucket permissions, or whether your EC2 instances are properly sized.
So it's like a series of automated audits constantly running in the background, making sure everything is up to snuff.
Precisely. And it doesn't just stop there. It then organizes all these checks into different categories.
Okay, so it's not just throwing a jumbled mess of data at us.
Nope, not at all.
Huh.
It groups the recommendations in a way that makes sense so you can focus on what's most important to you.
That's really helpful, especially when you consider how vast the AWS ecosystem is. So how does it actually work? I mean, what's going on behind the scenes when Trusted Advisor is analyzing my setup?
Well, at its core, it's all about comparing your current AWS configuration to this massive knowledge base of best practices. Think of it like having access to the collective wisdom of thousands of AWS experts, all distilled into this one tool.
Wow, so it's constantly drawing on that knowledge base to say, okay, based on what I'm seeing in this user's setup, here are the things they could be doing better.
Exactly. It's constantly learning and evolving, just like AWS itself.
And it doesn't just tell me what to fix, it tells me what to fix first.
Right. It prioritizes the recommendations based on their potential impact and severity.
This is starting to sound like a must-have for anyone serious about AWS. So how do we actually get our hands on this magical tool? Where do we find it in the vastness of the AWS console?
It's actually pretty easy to find. Just head over to the AWS Management Console and look for the Trusted Advisor service.
And once we're in, what are we looking at? What kind of information is Trusted Advisor showing us?
Well, you'll see a dashboard that gives you an overview of your AWS environment's health. It highlights those key areas that Trusted Advisor analyzes and then breaks down the recommendations by their severity level.
So at a glance, I can see where my biggest areas for improvement are.
Exactly. And if you want to dig deeper into a specific recommendation, you can just click on it to get more details.
That's great. And I know you mentioned earlier that Trusted Advisor organizes its recommendations into categories. Could you tell us a bit more about those? What kind of categories are we talking about here?
Sure. We have categories like cost optimization, performance, security, fault tolerance, service limits, and operational excellence. Each one focuses on a different aspect of your AWS environment.
Wow, that's quite a comprehensive list. It really does seem like Trusted Advisor covers all the bases.
It does. And each of those categories is packed with valuable insights and recommendations.
So where do we start? Let's dive into one of these categories. How about cost optimization? I think everyone's ears perk up when they hear that phrase.
You bet. Cost optimization is all about making sure you're not wasting money on unused resources or paying for services you don't need. Think of it as your personal cloud savings consultant.
So if I'm the type of person who forgets to turn off EC2 instances when I'm done with them, Trusted Advisor is going to call me out on that.
It certainly will. It can identify those idle instances and recommend either terminating them or right-sizing them to a smaller instance type that better fits your needs.
It's like having someone constantly reminding me to turn off the lights when I leave the room.
Exactly. Small changes can make a big difference.
This is already starting to sound like a game changer. All right, what about performance? What's Trusted Advisor looking for in that category?
Well, it's all about making sure your applications are running smoothly and quickly. Slow websites and sluggish applications lead to frustrated users, and nobody wants that.
And I'm guessing Trusted Advisor helps prevent those frustrations.
That's the goal. It can identify potential bottlenecks, suggest ways to optimize database performance, or even recommend using a content delivery network, CDN, to speed up your web applications.
So it's not just about saving money, it's about ensuring I'm delivering the best possible experience to my users.
Absolutely. Performance and user experience go hand in hand.
This is already starting to sound pretty impressive. And we haven't even touched on security yet. What does Trusted Advisor bring to the table there?
Security is, without a doubt, one of the most critical aspects of any cloud environment, and Trusted Advisor takes it very seriously.
I bet it does. What exactly is it looking for when it comes to security?
It can identify vulnerabilities in your security groups, flag improperly configured S3 buckets, and even alert you if you have user accounts with overly permissive permissions.
So it's like having a 247 security guard patrolling my cloud infrastructure.
You could say that. It's constantly on the lookout for potential security weaknesses and helps you address them before they become a problem.
Okay, this is all starting to paint a pretty incredible picture. But let's be honest. Sometimes security can feel like it's getting in the way of getting things done quickly. Do Trusted Advisor's recommendations ever make things more difficult?
I see what you mean. It's a good point. Security can sometimes feel like it's slowing things down. But what's great about Trusted Advisor is that it's not about blindly applying the most restrictive security settings.
So it's not just a robot blindly following a checklist.
Not at all. It's about finding the right balance between security and usability. The recommendations are tailored to your specific environment and take into account factors like your industry, compliance requirements, and the sensitivity of the data you're handling.
All right, that makes sense. I'm starting to see how this could actually be helpful rather than just adding extra steps to my workflow. Now, we still have a few more categories to cover, right?
We do. We still have fault tolerance and service limits to explore.
But before we jump into those, I'm curious, what's standing out to you so far about Trusted Advisor? Anything that's surprising you?
Honestly, I'm impressed by how comprehensive it is. It's not just about fixing those obvious problems. It's about taking a holistic view of my AWS environment and identifying areas for improvement across the board.
I agree. It's a really valuable tool, especially when you consider how quickly AWS evolves.
I'm definitely eager to learn more about those remaining categories and how they can help me take my AWS environment to that next level.
Well, let's dive into fault tolerance next. This is a category that's all about making your infrastructure resilient and prepared for the unexpected.
Buckle up, everyone. We're about to explore the world of fault tolerance and what Trusted Advisor can do to help us avoid those dreaded outages.
Okay, so fault tolerance. What we're really talking about here is building an AWS environment that can handle failures gracefully.
Right. So if one part of my setup goes down, the whole thing doesn't come crashing down with it.
Exactly. It's all about having those backup systems in place, that redundancy. Makes sense. But building in that kind of redundancy, isn't that usually complex and expensive?
It can be, yeah, but that's where Trusted Advisor is super helpful. It can help you pinpoint those single points of failure and then recommend ways to add redundancy without, breaking the bank.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Can you give me an example? Let's say I have a web server running on just one EC2 instance. What would Trusted Advisor suggest to make that setup more fault tolerant?
In that case, it might recommend setting up something called an elastic load balancer. It's often called an ELB for short.
ELB, got it. And what does that do?
Well, the ELB distributes traffic across multiple EC2 instances. So if one instance fails, the ELB automatically sends that traffic to the healthy instances, and that prevents downtime.
Oh, I see. So instead of having all my eggs in one basket, I'm spreading them out across multiple instances.
Exactly. It's a classic strategy for building more resilient systems.
That makes sense. But what about my data? How does fault tolerance apply to data storage?
Yeah, data is crucial. Trusted Advisor pays close attention to how you're storing and protecting your data.
So what kind of recommendations would it make in that area?
Well, for example, it might suggest using Amazon S3 versioning, which keeps multiple copies of your objects, or it might recommend setting up cross-region replication so your data is backed up in a geographically separate location.
Uh-huh. So even if a whole AWS region goes down, my data is still safe and accessible somewhere else.
Exactly. And it's not just about protection from those huge outages. Trusted Advisor can also help you design systems that can handle those more common failures, like a server going down down or a network issue.
So it's about building that resilience in at every level.
Exactly. And the really cool part is that Trusted Advisor tailors its recommendations to your specific workload and your risk tolerance. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
This is really sounding like a must-have for anyone who's, serious about building reliable systems on AWS.
I think so too. It can really make a difference in terms of peace of mind, knowing that your infrastructure is prepared for almost anything.
Okay, I'm definitely sold on fault tolerance. Now let's move on to service limits. I know this is an area where a lot of AWS users have run into some trouble at some point.
Yeah, service limits, they're important, but they can definitely be a bit of a headache if you're not careful. Basically, each AWS service has these limits on how much you can use it.
Right, like how many API calls you can make or how much storage you can use.
Exactly. And if you hit those limits, it can cause problems, anything from slow performance to a full-on service disruption.
Ugh, I've definitely had those late night panics trying to increase service limits before something breaks.
And that's exactly where Trusted Advisor can help. It's like having a watchdog that constantly monitors your service usage, so you get those alerts before you hit any limits.
Okay, so it's like an early warning system for potential service disruptions. That's incredibly helpful.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop at just alerting you, it actually recommends what you can do about it.
Like request a limit increase from AWS.
Exactly. It's much better to be proactive than reactive when it comes to service limits.
I agree. But how does Trusted Advisor know which service limits are actually relevant to Emmy? I mean, there are so many AWS services. It seems impossible to keep track of all those limits manually.
You're right, there are a ton. But the good news is that Trusted Advisor is smart enough to analyze your usage patterns and focus on the service limits that are most likely to impact you.
So it's not just blindly monitoring every single limit. It's actually personalized.
That's right. It's like having a service limit advisor that understands your workloads and anticipates potential issues.
That's fantastic. And does it give me any specific information about those limits?
Oh, yeah. It provides detailed information about each relevant service limit, like your current usage, the limit itself, and even instructions on how to request an increase.
Wow, that's incredibly helpful. It's like getting a sneak peek into the inner workings of AWS.
Exactly. It's all about simplifying things and helping you avoid those frustrating surprises.
This has been incredibly informative. So we've covered cost optimization, performance, security, fault tolerance, and service limits. That leaves us with one final category to explore: operational excellence. What's in store for us there?
Well, operational excellence, it's really all about ensuring that your AWS environment is running smoothly and efficiently. It's about following those best practices and avoiding common mistakes.
So it's like having a virtual operations manager, double-checking our work and making sure we're doing things the right way.
Exactly. It can help you identify areas where you might be deviating from best practices, maybe like using outdated instance types or having those security groups that are too open.
I'm guessing these recommendations go beyond just the basic configuration settings.
Oh, absolutely. Trusted Advisor can also recommend architectural improvements, maybe using AWS CloudFormation to automate your infrastructure deployments,
Yeah.
or implementing monitoring and login to get better visibility into your systems.
So it's not just about fixing individual problems. It's about helping me build a more robust and well-managed cloud environment overall.
Exactly. It's all about embracing those DevOps principles of automation, continuous improvement, and efficiency.
This is really starting to sound like a total transformation of how I manage my AWS environment. And it's all thanks to this one tool, Trusted Advisor.
It's a powerful tool, that's for sure. And it can really help you level up your AWS game.
I'm super impressed with everything we've covered so far. But before we wrap things up, I have one more question. We've talked about all these different categories and checks. How do I know which recommendations to prioritize? It's great to have all this advice, but it can be overwhelming to try and tackle everything at once.
That's a great point. It's easy to get excited about all the potential improvements and try to do too much too quickly.
So how do we avoid that? What's the best way to approach this?
I'd say the key is to start with the recommendations that are most critical to your business goals and risk tolerance.
So for example, if I'm hyper-focused on security, maybe I start with the security category and work down from there.
Exactly. Or if cost optimization is your top priority, you could start with that category and look for those recommendations with the biggest potential savings.
And what about someone who's just starting out with AWS? Are there any specific recommendations you'd consider essential for beginners?
There are definitely some foundational ones that everyone should focus on, regardless of their experience. Enabling multi-factor authentication, MFA, for your AWS account is absolutely crucial for security, and setting up budget alerts can help you avoid those unexpected cost overruns.
Those are great tips. So it's about finding that balance between addressing those critical issues, optimizing for your specific goals, and gradually building up those cloud management skills.
Exactly. And remember, Trusted Advisor is there to guide you every step of the way.
This has been such an eye-opening experience. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how to effectively manage my AWS environment.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you. And keep in mind, this is just the beginning. There's so much more you can do with Trusted Advisor, from customizing those checks to even automating remediation actions.
I'm definitely eager to dive deeper and see how I can use those advanced features. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a great foundation in AWS Trusted Advisor.
I agree.
Well, on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. A huge thanks to our guest for sharing their expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And, of course, a huge thank you to our amazing listeners for joining us on this deep dive into AWS Trusted Advisor. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the cloud.